Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and it's time to wrap up week 73 with Silmarillion Saturday. Now, these Saturdays are our chance to revisit the history and legends of the Elder Days, whether they come from the Silmarillion, the Unfinished Tales, or something else altogether. Now, last week, we continued Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age from the Silmarillion, specifically at the rings that ended up in the hands of 9 very unfortunate men with simple wardrobes, and dwarves who were mostly oblivious. We also learned about the destruction of Numenor and Sauron's flight to Barad-dûr. Today, we're going to move on to the realms of Numenor in exile, Gondor and Arnor, and the roles they played in the Second Age. In that time, those of the Númenóreans who were saved from destruction fled eastward, as is told in the Akallabeth. The chief of these were Elendil the Tall, and his sons Isildur and Anarion. Kinsmen of the king they were, descendants of Elros, but they had been unwilling to listen to Sauron, and had refused to make war on the lords of the west. Manning their ships with all who remained faithful, they forsook the land of Numenor ere ruin came upon it. They were mighty men, and their ships were strong and tall, but the tempests overtook them, and they were borne aloft on hills of water even to the clouds, and they descended upon Middle-earth like birds of the storm. Elendil was cast up by the waves in the land of Lindon, and he was befriended by Gil-galad. Thence he passed up the river Lune, and beyond Ered Luin he established his realm, and his people dwelt in many places in Eriador about the courses of the Lune and the Branduin. But his chief city was at Annúminas, beside the water of Lake Nenúil. At Fornost upon the North Downs also the Númenóreans dwelt, and in Cardolan, and in the hills of Rhudaur, and towers they raised upon Emen-Berid and upon Amon-Sul, and there remain many barrows and ruined works in those places, but the towers of Emen-Berid still look towards the sea. Isildur and Anarion were borne away southwards, and at the last they brought their ships up the great river Anduin, that flows out of Rhovanion into the western sea in the Bay of Belfalas, and they established a realm in those lands that were after called Gondor, whereas the northern kingdom was named Arnor. Long before, in the days of their power, the mariners of Numenor had established a haven and strong places about the mouths of Anduin, in despite of Sauron in the Black Land that lay nigh upon the east. In the later days to this haven came only the faithful of Numenor, and many therefore of the folk of the coastlands in that region were in whole or in part akin to the elf friends and the people of Elendil, and they welcomed his sons. The chief city of this southern realm was Osgiliath, through the midst of which the great river flowed, and the Númenóreans built there a great bridge, upon which there were towers and houses of stone wonderful to behold, and tall ships came up out of the sea to the quays of the city. Other strong places they built also upon either hand, Minas Ithil, the tower of the rising moon, eastward upon a shoulder of the mountains of shadow as a threat to Mordor, and to the westward Minas Anor, the tower of the setting sun at the feet of Mount Mindalluin, as a shield against the wild men of the dales. In Minas Ithil was the house of Isildur, and in Minas Anor the house of Anarion, but they shared the realm between them, and their thrones were set side by side in the great hall of Osgiliath. These were the chief dwellings of the Númenóreans in Gondor, but other works marvelous and strong they built in the land in the days of their power, at the Argonath, and at Aglarond, and at Erech, and in the circle of Angranost, which men called Isengard. They made the pinnacle of Orthanc, of unbreakable stone. Many treasures and great heirlooms of virtue and wonder the exiles had brought from Numenor, and of these the most renowned were the 7 stones and the white tree. The white tree was grown from the fruit of Nimloth the Fair, that stood in the courts of the king at Armenelos in Numenor, ere Sauron burned it, and Nimloth was in its turn descended from the tree of Tirion, that was an image of the eldest of trees, white Telperion, which Yavanna caused to grow in the land of the Valar. The tree, memorial of the Eldar and of the light of Valinor, was planted in Minas Ithil before the house of Isildur, since he it was that had saved the fruit from destruction. But the stones were divided, 3 Elendil took, and his sons each 2. Those of Elendil were set in towers upon Emen-Berid, and upon Aman-Sul, and in the city of Anuminus. But those of his sons were at Minas Ithil and Minas Arnor, and at Orthanc, and in Osgiliath. Now these stones had this virtue, that those who looked therein might perceive in them things far off, whether in place or in time. For the most part they revealed only things near to another kindred stone, for the stones each called to each. But those who possessed great strength of will and of mind might learn to direct their gaze whither they would. Thus the Númenóreans were aware of many things that their enemies wished to conceal, and little escaped their vigilance in the days of their might. It is said that the towers of Emen-Berid were not built indeed by the exiles of Númenor, but were raised by Gil-galad for Elendil his friend, and the seeing stone of Emen-Berid was set in Elostirion, the tallest of the towers. Thither Elendil would repair, and thence he would gaze out over the sundering seas when the yearning of exile was upon him. And it is believed that thus he would at whiles see far away even the tower of Avalone upon Eressëa, where the master stone abode and yet abides. These stones were gifts of the Eldar to Amandil, father of Elendil, for the comfort of the faithful of Númenor in their dark days, when the elves might come no longer to that land under the shadow of Sauron. They were called the Palantiri, those that watch from afar. But all those that were brought to Middle-earth long ago were lost. Now we get the saving of the faithful of Númenor and the establishment of the 2 realms in exile. The first was Elendil's realm in the north, based at Anuminus, with towers on Emen-Berid and Aman-Sul. The second was the realm of Gondor, established by his sons Isildur and Anarion, Gondor's capital at Osgiliath, built around the great river. Now, in those early days, the places that we now know of as Minas Morgul and Minas Tirith were built, but then they were called Minas Ithil and Minas Arnor, clearly connected to their namesakes, Minas Ithil for Isildur and Minas Arnor for Anarion. Not that they each lived in their respectively named cities. No, they sat on thrones next to each other in Osgiliath. And then we get a glimpse at the work of these Númenóreans in exile, the Argonath, Aglarond, Erech, and Orthanc. More on those some other time, perhaps on a few Middle-earth Map Mondays. In the meantime, we get a glimpse of the White Tree and its story before learning how the stones were split between the kingdoms and how they were utilized. Personally, I love that the stone of Emen-Berid was set to enable Elendil to look out over the sea, catching glimpses of the Tower of Avalone on the Lonely Isle. Well, folks, that does it for this week's Silmarillion Saturday. Thank you for joining me. Please come back next week as we continue Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, ironically, with the end of the Second Age. Please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can get an ad-free feed, bonus episodes, and become a part of my content council to help me decide what I'll talk about next series. Now, podcast listeners, please be sure to subscribe to the TTT in your podcast apps. For those on YouTube, subscribe to this channel to get all of the PPP productions, including almost 9 full seasons of the PPP, both seasons of the Rings of Power wrap-up, all of this show, and my new streaming project, PPP Plays. And be sure you're following @PrancingPonyPod on Blue Sky, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and simply the Prancing Pony Podcast on Facebook. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.